Good evening and welcome to our second session, which is devoted to Europe at the Crossroads after the shock. We're still smack in the middle of this emergency. However, this is a good opportunity to discuss on how to defend democracy among global disorder and if there is a role to play for Europe. These two events organized by Fondazione Corriere della Sera together with ResetDOC. We have Simone Disegni with us who works for ResetDOC, and he will be there with some top-notch experts, namely I'm talking about Marta, Dassù, Guetta, Shada and Timothy Garton Ash on how Europe can carve itself a role in the international panorama. As I was saying, we're still in the middle of an emergency because, as we discussed last week, many countries have introduced some form of lockdown. However, in the previous weeks, a sort of window came up during which European leaders managed to discuss foreign policies, not just about the economy and recovery fund, so as to tackle some important topics such as sanctions to Belarus, any sanctions to Turkey, Russia for the Navalny case. And this has once again highlighted how difficult it is for Europe to speak with a single voice. Now let me turn the microphone over to Simone, who will be introducing his panel. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'd like to welcome you all. Francesca, as you just said, we are at the crossroads. That's why we decided to give the title to both sessions, because last Monday we discussed the first then branch of this crossroads. Namely, we discussed the economic construction and the economic monetary unit with the challenges of the next generation EU and recovery fund with all the issues that are related to that in terms of the construction of Europe, also at an institutional level. But then, as we heard last week from Professor Alberto Saravalle, there is a second branch, namely the construction of a complicated geopolitical position. And yesterday, we had the 27th anniversary of the coming into force of the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, and that's when then a political character was given to the European Union with a clear mandate to act internationally. Over the past 27 years, not much has changed in terms of procedures because the rule is unchanged. The rule is still one of unanimity because no foreign policy decision can be made without unanimous consent. But in 1993, we had 12 members. Now this has gone up to 27 after Brexit. That's why things got complicated. And then in practical terms, we know how the world was totally disrupted. It's possibly less hospitable for the EU. It is more complex, where democracy faces a number of challenges, and where multilateralism is almost a four-letter word. And it seems the US has grown further apart. These are the topics we'll be broaching tonight. Let me introduce tonight's panelists. In the round table, we have Marta, Dassù, Guetta, and Shada. However, the first speaker we have today, and it's a great honor to have him from Oxford, is Professor Timothy Garton Ash. By the way, at the end, last but not least, there will be a closing talk and interview with Italy's Minister for European Affairs, Mr. Enzo Amendola. As I was saying, we have Timothy Garton Ash, who's a professor of European Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Stanford University. We know him as a writer, as an analyst for the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, many other international. The latest book is The Magic Lantern, dedicated to 1989 revolution. Please, you have the floor.
Buonasera. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you in virtual Milan, to do something again with Reset, but also as someone who writes regularly for La Repubblica, to do something with Corriere della Sera, and of course with our wonderful panel. It's a really interesting moment to be talking about this subject, because of course so much will depend on what happens tomorrow. And if we're going to have a chance of defending democracy amid global disorder, and indeed reducing global disorder, not just one, but three things have to happen tomorrow. Joe Biden has to win. He has to win so clearly that all but a minority of Trump voters will accept it as the result of a free and fair election, and he then has to launch the country on a path of domestic renewal and a return to liberal international order. And this takes me to my first point, which is the defense of democracy begins at home. I spent many years writing a history of the Cold War, and it's absolutely clear that by far the most important thing the West did, we in the West did, to win the Cold War, was to keep our own societies dynamic, democratic, open, and attractive. That was far more important than anything we did in foreign policy, and the same is still true today. So defending democracy starts at home. Now, I think what we can say about the COVID experience, I think the one political generalization we can make so far about how COVID has been handled is that across the board, populists have done very badly. We cannot say democracies have done well and authoritarians have done badly, because some democracies have done well and some badly. Some dictatorships have done badly, but some rather well. But we can say that populists, be it Johnson or Trump or Bolsonaro or Kaczynski or Erdogan or Modi, they've all done badly. However, the consequences of COVID, what Martin Wolf has called the long COVID economically, could very well create conditions which are extremely favorable to populists. If we get high unemployment, widespread insecurity, very high levels of public debt, in many places up to the levels at the end of the Second World War, and possibly high inflation, those will be very good conditions for populists. So we have the first struggle we have on our hands is to defend democracy at home in times of populism, which may come back with as much force as before. When I say at home, as an English European, I also still mean the European Union. Now, I had to laugh when I saw in your program the talking point, is the EU able and willing to become the global guarantor of democracy and the rule of law? Because, of course, at the moment, the EU is not even able to guarantee democracy and the rule of law amongst its own member states. Poland, a country close to my heart and Guetta, as I know, is an illiberal democracy, a liberal democracy in decay, but there are major forces of resistance on the streets at the moment. But Hungary, I would argue, is no longer a democracy. I'm prepared to defend that claim in discussion. Jean Monnet said at the beginning of the 1970s, a dictatorship can exist somewhere in Europe, but a dictatorship cannot exist inside the European community. That is impossible. It has to be a community of democracies. So the fact that we have a country that is no longer a democracy as a member state of the European Union is a very, very serious problem indeed. And what is more, what we have to understand is, because the democracy was eroded by Viktor Orban while Hungary was a member state of the European Union, it's carefully designed to have a facade of pluralist liberal democracy, right? So the whole system is set up to look like a democracy and seem like a democracy and meet the Copenhagen criteria of the European Union, but not in reality to be one. What is more, it is a system that thrives on very large financial transfers from the European Union, the structural funds, but now also European recovery funds, which flow mainly through the national government and therefore in the hands of Viktor Orban and Fidesz. What is more, in order to get the deal on the recovery fund, what to some extent happened was that addressing the north-south problem, which you in Italy know so well, namely the chronic problems of the Eurozone, which we did very successfully, was done to some extent at the expense of addressing the West-East problem, because you had to get Poland and Hungary on board. This fact of having a member state that is no longer a democracy is not only undermining the basic values and legal order of the European Union, it's also extremely damaging to our international credibility. How can we be credible in arguing for democracy in Belarus or Ukraine or in the Maghreb if we don't have it even in our own European Union? Now, as I move on to the wider regional and global challenges, I want to say one or two things about what you just mentioned in your introduction, the institutional arrangements. So you have another agenda point which says, after Brexit, a geopolitical union, question mark. I can absolutely see the logic of saying we need to move to qualified majority voting on foreign policy. I can completely see that logic. And of course, it might be somewhat less difficult to get there without the UK as a member state. My question is whether, and this is also a question to Marta Dassù, who has great experience in this, whether the gain in terms of policy efficacy that you might get through QMV outweighs the difficulty of getting to that point in the first place, to QMV, and the possible discontent and anger of a member state being overruled on an issue of foreign policy, be it, for example, Hungary. What we can definitely say, and some work done for my own research project at Oxford and the work of Vivian Schmidt, who you had on last week, confirms this, is that overwhelmingly what Europeans are looking for from the European Union is what in the jargon of political science is called output legitimacy, not input legitimacy. In other words, they're interested in what the EU does, what it delivers in foreign as well as in domestic policy, and not how exactly it does it. The democratic deficit is vastly overestimated. It's a concern of a minority of Europeans. Most people think that the EU is, broadly speaking, democratically legitimate, although not a democracy itself. What they're concerned about is what it delivers. The other point on after Brexit, a geopolitical union, is I hope you don't think that nothing would be lost if you somehow lose the weight of Britain, its diplomacy, its military, its intelligence experience, its financial expertise, its technology of various kinds, fintech, IT, biotech, AI, all of that Britain has brought to the table. I don't think you want to lose that. And the way not to lose it is this. One of the very few good ideas the Boris Johnson government has had is that when it chairs the G7 in the course of next year, it should bring in a number of key democracies, particularly from Asia. They talk about the D10, Australia, Japan, India, for example, into that larger global conversation about the global challenges we face. And for me, that is the bridge both to keeping Britain as one of those democracies closely involved from issue to issue, and in what a Biden administration might do as it tries to bring the United States back into the supporters of liberal international order, into the Paris climate agreement, and so on. And the way I would put this is what we need is a post-hegemonic network of democracies. A network of democracies, not a fixed alliance of democracies, because then you always have the question, who's in and who's out, but a network of democracies. And that, for me, is the way to approach this issue as we hopefully go forward between the US and the EU in the defense of democracy facing global disorder. Now, what then is the division of labor? Well, the fundamental division of labor is clearly, and this is so obvious it hardly needs stating, that Europe plays a greater role in its own region. That means fundamentally two things, the South and the East. We have such fantastic competence on the South in the panel on the issues of the Middle East and North Africa that I will only say two things on that. One, that there has to be a mutual engagement between EU member states interested in the East and those interested in the South. In short, Italy has to be concerned about the eastern neighborhood and Poland has to be concerned about the southern neighborhood. And secondly, that of course, the already predictable consequences of climate change will make the refugee flows from the Middle East, wider Middle East and North Africa much larger. In terms of Eastern Europe, we have seen in Belarus over the last 2 months one of the most extraordinary examples of civil resistance in the entire history of civil resistance. People in large numbers have gone out on the street day after day, night after night, in the face of really brutal repression from the Lukashenko regime, day after day. It's been hugely impressive, in many ways more impressive than what happened in Ukraine. The problem is that there are none of the intermediary institutions or actors between the peacefully protesting people and Lukashenko and his army and security forces and plainclothes thugs to negotiate a transition. There's actually, therefore, a definite limit at the moment to what we as Europe can do about that. Definitely keep on the sanctions on the Lukashenko team, definitely give support to civil society, media, and the opposition. But the key point here, and this applies also to Ukraine, in my view, is less tactical than strategic. Enlargement, EU enlargement, has arguably been the most successful policy in the history of the European Union, from the first enlargement to the last. It is the peaceful form of promoting regime change. And we have to make sure that the prospect of enlargement, a genuine commitment to enlargement from our side, from the EU, remains credible in the medium term for Belarus, for Ukraine. And that therefore means that we have to be serious about enlargement to the Western Balkans, because that gives a clear signal that enlargement has not simply stalled. The other point I would make, again, a strategic one, is about Russia, and that is that difficult and dangerous though the challenge from Putin's regime is at the moment, and you mentioned Navalny, an attempted political murder with a chemical agent, with a nerve agent only available to high security people with high security access to the regime. But medium to long term, I am much more optimistic about Russia. I think that particularly with the energy transition, particularly with generational change, actually the Putin's regime's days will be numbered in years, not in days, but in years. And we have to be open to that opportunity of forging a partnership with Russia, and crucially, because while at the moment Putin has a close alliance with Xi Jinping and China, longer term, there's clearly going to be a compelling argument for Russia to go with the West rather than China. This brings me briefly to my last area, which is the global disorder. I've already suggested how I think we go about it. US, EU, and a network of democracies, including the UK, but also key players in Asia, plus, of course, other powers that are not democracy, issue by issue. In terms of global issues, I've been talking to people on the Biden campaign. They have clear strategic priorities. They call them the 3 C's: COVID and its economic consequences, climate change, and China. To take the third of those first, we clearly are in a major multidimensional strategic competition with China, which could loosely be called a Cold War. It certainly has things in common with the Cold War, even if we are not wise to call it such. And if we look at what's happened in Hong Kong, if we look at the gulag that's been erected in Xinjiang, if we look at the extremely aggressive language and posture towards the Chinese democracy of Taiwan, we can see how serious the threat is. But at the same time, China is even more than the Soviet Union was, a serious global ideological competitor. It is an entity, and one that looks quite attractive as a model of developmental authoritarianism to people in Africa and Latin America. So here we need more than ever the EU-US network of democracies approach with a division of labor between us, but at the same time as fierce competition and deterrence, we also, much more than in the first Cold War, need cooperation, because the imperatives of cooperation to fight a pandemic like COVID, to fight the economic consequences of COVID, and above all, to combat the effects of climate change, demand much more cooperation with communist-ruled China than we ever needed with the Soviet Union. So both the competition and the cooperation are needed at a higher level. Very last point, and I'm just coming up to my 20 minutes, so I'll end on this. This is, of course, a quite daunting agenda. If we go into a bookshop today and go to the politics session and look at the titles, we find titles like The Light That Failed, The End of the Liberal Mind, The Twilight of Democracy, How Democracies Die, The End of Democracy. There's a theme emerging here, I think. Now, of course, this is partly to get secure good book sales on Amazon. If it bleeds, it leads. And by the way, they're all excellent books, and I wish them many readers on Amazon. It's also a Cassandra exercise. These are all people committed to liberal democracy trying to warn against the dangers to liberal democracy. But nonetheless, I think there is a danger of falling from an extreme of liberal optimism in the 1990s and early 2000s, when history was all meant to be going our way, to an extreme of liberal pessimism or even liberal fatalism, which is expressed in these somewhat Spenglerian titles. The Polish philosopher Leszek Kołakowski had a favorite story about two little girls running through the Jardin de Luxembourg. One of them was clearly ahead, but the other one kept shouting, "I'm winning, I'm winning, I'm winning." And in the end, the girl who was ahead collapsed in tears, and the one who was behind got ahead and actually won. And there's a deep truth in that story, which is, obviously, we have to run fast, but we also have to have belief in liberal democracy, self-belief. In fact, I would say that the belief in freedom is itself a crucial part of freedom's power. So despite all these daunting threats, despite all the things that we need to do simultaneously, I think we also need to keep our belief in freedom's power and in the greater attraction of liberal democracy, and we will come out on top in the end. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Garton Ash. You've given us a lot of food for thought for the panel to come, as well as our closing talk. Let me now introduce our panelists, the panelists of our virtual roundtable. We'll start with Marta Dassù, who's the director of the Aspen journal. She is in Rome. Good afternoon. In Paris, from Paris, we've got Bernard Guetta, the Honorable Bernard Guetta, who's been a long-standing journalist for Le Monde and many other French magazines. He's now a Europarlament or an MP. And then we have Shada Islam, who's an analyst, a keen analyst of European affairs. She's well known in Brussels. She was also director of the Think Tank for Europe. Now she is the senior advisor of European Policy Center, as well as a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Atolin. So I'd like to start with you, Mrs. Dassù, because Garton Ash actually referred to you when talking about procedures, talking about the qualified majority. But I'd like to start from what Professor Garton Ash said about the order that might come out after the US elections. He mentioned the post-hegemonic network democracies. Is this something that might convince you, Mrs. Dassù, and what role may be played by the EU? Thank you. I mean, as usual, Professor Garton Ash was so compelling and stimulating. It's difficult for me to discuss any other issues. I'll just try and pick some of the issues you raised, Timothy, and try to expand on them. I fully agree with you, Timothy, that the China issue will be decisive, especially in terms of the relations between US and Europe, and whether then Europe may see itself as a geopolitical power. And there is no doubt that China, as you said, is the systemic rival of the future. I don't think Russia has, or Putin's Russia has then a bright future ahead of it because of the many problems such as the attitude of the new generation, the decline of oil prices, which was paramount for Putin's power. So I do think that's how we should look at things. So relative decline in Russia, whilst China seems to be the real challenger in the current century. In such a landscape, I think that the only solution left is to have a robust relationship with the US, and then also to enlarge the club of democracies and open up to new players, such as, Asia Pacific, Japan, and the like. I mean, countries which, according to the American view, might contribute to curbing China, but it won't be so straightforward. Talking about the community democracies, I mean, I did talk to some of my friends on Biden campaign, and I know that's what they'd like to discuss, namely eco-democracies ranging from Europe to Asia. After all, it's not a brand new idea. I mean, Albright discussed it back her time, but when there is such a strong rivalry between China and US, this becomes even more important. But I'm not 100% convinced that US and Europe do see the China issue exactly in the same terms, because Europe, after all, kept seeing China, especially in economic commercial terms, and I think it still does, whilst the US see China as a direct military threat, especially in the Asia Pacific. So in order to reach a proper agreement on China, quite a lot of negotiations will be required between the US and Europe. And the bandwidth is pretty poor. I think then Europe should take on a more strategic view vis-à-vis China, much more than has been doing so far. But I think that the real issue for the future democracy lies here too. There is no doubt that China is indeed the systemic alternative, a potential alternative system. Authoritarian capitalism controlled by the Communist Party, which is trying to establish itself even more after the COVID pandemic. And also what is happening in NATO. I mean, trying to decide what NATO should become by 2030. I think that it's inevitable that NATO will lose some of its relevancy in the US eyes unless it will be able to deal with the China issue. So I think that's relevant both for already existing alliances and any future ones. The same applies to trade. I think in the 90s, we deluded ourselves that the accession of China into WTO might help it to become more similar to us, but that's not how things went. So I think another equally relevant point will be the reformation of the WTO. You mentioned also the second C, climate change, where China is touting its attentions right and left, but it remains to see whether they mean it. I think that the China issue will be decisive, but I don't think it will be easy to reconcile European and US policies, but it will be a determinant factor. Europe has long seen itself as a model for the rest of the world, especially for the neighboring countries. I mean, international federation based on liberal nation states and the rule of law. And I agree with you, Timothy, that the drift that we see in countries such as Hungary and Poland we can see it in these tough negotiations on the Migration Pact, as well as on the distribution of cohesion funds of the next multi-year budget, or MFF. I know that you talked in favor of the enlargement policy, and I see your point, but it's equally true that when a country is a candidate for accession, then you, as Europe, has a stronger negotiating instrument. But once the country has acceded the EU, then your negotiating power, barring Article 7, is lost. As for the opportunity of keep on enlarging the EU without having a profound inner restructuring, leaves me quite skeptical, because we're seeing what happens and how complicated it is to make decisions when there are so many members. So I think we should keep a door open for the EU, but then it remains to be seen whether inside we can actually build a EU which has a solid core of countries that can make some tough decisions. But that does not mean, may I just close this line of reasoning? Just 2 final points. Well, this does not mean I'm not so convinced about this foreign policy, because for foreign policy to work, some people, need to have recourse to military power, and that would be difficult without a majority. I think that we as Europeans have never discussed a common foreign policy, even for the Near East. The jargon we use, such as neighborhood policy, that do not seem to work. And the real question mark we need to address is whether Europe, after the Arab Springs, is still interested in promoting democracy as such. For instance, in the Mediterranean area and the Middle East, whether Europe is more interested in protecting its own stability. I think it's a big question mark, which we'll have to address. Just as we'll have to address the big differences between European core countries, the way that France and Italy, we're really sorry of being so fragmented, but we don't always hear Mrs. Dassù. Take Libya. So China first, as I said, US and Europe, but also Asian democracies. And this Europe is very much withdrawn in itself, especially because of COVID. But as you were saying, there might be some issues of democratic legitimacy, and then a question mark for me about enlargement, because I'm not too sure that we can actually defend it as a strategic policy. And finally, the need for a common geopolitical vision, which is at the moment lacking.
Thank you. We had a few sound issues, unfortunately. But I guess we could get most of what you said. So again, reference was made to the neighborhood policy, and I would like to ask Bernard Guetta something about this. Bernard Guetta was a correspondent from Moscow, from Warsaw. He traveled widely. He talked about the European East and Russia in his books. In one of your books, if I may, one of your best books, most fascinating books, you wrote that your intimate conviction of being a pro-European was actually born in the roads of Yerevan in Armenia in 1989. And it is in those very years, in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that you convinced yourself of how right the European project was, and you decided to devote all your intellectual and today political resources. So you're a strong pro-European, and this is a book that is also published in Italy. So my question is the following. How do you think we can actually respond to that extraordinary civil resistance show that Mr. Garton Ash and Ms. Dassù mentioned, by helping that country become democratic without being accused of interfering in the home affairs of another country? And the same holds true for Russia and rational dissenters.
Well, first, thank you for your invitation. Thank you to team, and thank you to Marta Dassù. And the first thing I will tell you is that pessimism is intellectually chic. Optimism is never regarded as realistic. Optimism is always regarded as naive. But today, too bad for me, I will be optimistic. Optimistic, but not blind, nor naive. As you do, I know that the United States of America, the richest and most powerful democracy in the world, the country which was the main force behind the victories against Nazism and communism, could break tomorrow with democracy, liberties, and human rights. America could become a kind of Hungary, Orban's Hungary, if Donald Trump were re-elected tomorrow. India already become a democratorship, half a democracy, half a dictatorship. China is not at all ashamed, just the opposite, to explain that democracy is a weaker system, that it's a one-party regime. And there is, in the largest democracies, an intellectual exhaustion of the left and the right, and a democratic fatigue in public opinion. With an economic crisis becoming frightening because of the pandemic, we have all reasons to fear that this century could see the end not only of European unity, but also of democracy all around the world, except maybe in Norway. But no, no and no. I don't share this rather common view, and I would like to tell you why. First point, there is indeed a democratic fatigue, but only in democratic countries. Hong Kong dreams of liberty, as Iran does, as the Arabic countries do. Viktor Orban lost the 10th largest Hungarian city at the last local election and is clearly afraid, and rightly so, of losing his majority in the next national election. The demonstrations in Poland are very impressive, and there in Warsaw the conservative majority is more and more divided since the last presidential election in August. Next point. There is a Putin fatigue in Russia, and I do agree with Timothy about Russia and this fatigue. Mr. Putin is in a very poor situation in the Middle East because his only ally, the Iranian regime, is weakened by Iraqi and Lebanese crisis, the economic sanctions, and the pandemic. Bashar al-Assad and Putin won the war, but this was a Pyrrhic victory. And Putin is in a deadlock in Ukraine and now in Belarus, less and less popular, and unable to restore the economic situation because the oil prices will not increase in the coming years. The Russian elite, with or without Putin, will have to try to reach a security and cooperation agreement with the European Union because the Chinese option would be a national suicide. Third point, the idea of a common European defense is not anymore a taboo in the member states, not even in Poland, because everybody now understands that Europe is not anymore a national priority for the United States. What was already clear during the Georgian crisis and the Syrian war became official with Trump and would not change with Biden. There will be a European defense, roughly speaking, in 2 decades, and this will change a lot of things because, next point, because a European Union with a European currency, common rules, common industrial policies, common investments, common institutions, and a common defense will be more than a simple union. Confederation or federation, I don't know. Nobody knows. It will be already an actor on the international stage, a wealthy one, able to negotiate a new alliance with the US, a coexistence with Russia, and a new economic complementarity with the South Rims of the Mare Nostrum. Fifth point, there will be no certainties. Everything will be difficult, but we will succeed because it is a necessity and because, strangely enough, Russia and the US will need a strong European Union, both of them because of China. Next point. Therefore, the 2 European priorities should be to put on the table as soon as possible proposals to Washington and Moscow, ideas for a new Atlantic alliance and a new Helsinki agreement. Next point. If Mr. Trump were re-elected this week, it would be easier to find unanimity on foreign affairs inside the Union. With Mr. Biden as the next American president, the European unanimity will be more difficult to reach. But the new team in Washington could understand rather quickly that it would be in the best American interest to have a strong ally in Europe willing to finance its own defense. Point 8. Polls show a deep political confusion in Europe, except on European unity and populist movements. Europeans, and now not even people in the United Kingdom, don't want to leave the EU, and the new nationalists are losing ground in almost every country. Next point. There is obviously, I'm crossing my fingers, there is obviously every reason to hope that Joe Biden will be elected this week. 10th and last point, all things considered, it's not too optimistic to reject pessimism and to expect in this century the survival of democracy and the birth of a strong and political union of a new kind, the United States of Europe, politically united in cultural, historical, and institutional diversity. Thank you to you.
Thank you, Mr. Guetta, for this message of optimism. In the midst of a pandemic, it is difficult for us to look outside our own homes and to have a longer-term approach, but we have to do so, indeed. With this, I'd like to ask Shada Isma the following question.
Well, we have already touched on many issues, but you are the one who possibly knows best the discussions going on in the European backstage in Brussels. there is a concept which for a few months or even years has been often discussed in strategic documents, and namely strategic autonomy as a key to read the mission of the European Union. So that's what the President of the European Council called it, in order to be ready for these new geopolitical changes. What does this concept mean exactly? Is it the right path to take in order to interpret all the points that have been raised so far?
Thank you very much indeed for that question, and also for inviting me to take part in this very interesting, fascinating conversation. Absolutely, the answer to your question, Simone, is absolutely. Strategic autonomy is crucial for the future development of the European Union. Before I get into that conversation and talk about the assets and the need for strategic autonomy for Europe to stand on its own 2 feet and to walk out of the shadow of the United States, in a sense, I want to come back to some of the issues that have been raised by the previous speakers. I want to take us a little bit outside our comfort zone. And I'd like to take a little less of a Eurocentric approach. I'm a great believer in the European Union, but I believe that if we are too centered on ourselves and fail to see the world as it is, then we come up with flawed policies, which are detrimental to the European Union's role in this very complex and complicated world. Now, just to take first the whole concept of global disorder. I know it looks like this, and it looks like chaos and a very disorderly world from where we're sitting here in the European Union. We see that Donald Trump has taken a sledgehammer to the transatlantic relationship. He's been rooting for Brexit, and he's often called the European Union almost America's enemy number one. So America First has really shaken us and stirred us. And it's no surprise that that has colored our view of the world. And we see danger and risks in this development. Change. This is a period of transition rather than disorder. Transitioning a world that we've known for 70 years or so, towards a world where there will be many players, big and small, democracies and no democracies, authoritarians and dictatorships, small and big, and rich and poor, all on the same stage, trying to work out coalitions and areas of interest. And I believe that climate change is a very important facet where we can, if we work together, come together. So, this period of change was going to come. We've seen, Simone, for several years now, almost a decade, how the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils of this world were really demanding a say in how the world is run. And because they weren't getting that voice in the World Bank, in the IMF, etc., they started developing their own parallel institutions, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank, etc. So they were demanding the way the multilateral rules-based system has been working and to have a voice in that. Now, we at the moment are also struck, I think, by two developments that have shaken us a bit as well. So our narrative about, how should I put it, Western superiority, in a sense, has been shaken by the fact that we've been terrible in the West at dealing with COVID-19. Our deaths, our infection rates are higher. Our leaders have been, I would say, really remiss in dealing with it. We in parts of Asia and parts of Africa. There is more competency, if you like, in moving forward, and COVID-19 has been framed properly and is under control to some extent. Nothing's, of course, success yet, but this is changing. So we can, as Europeans and Americans, learn from other countries. We do not have a monopoly on good, intelligent thinking, and here we've really shown our feet of clay. Also, during this pandemic, there's been a entire change in how we view our society. We've seen that suddenly we need people that we had actually not considered to be that important in our lives. The transport workers, the doctors and nurses, the teachers, the essential workers. And who are in many parts of Europe these essential workers? These are migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. So a lot of the perception that we have of a world turned upside down, I believe, comes from the fact that we are being questioned and challenged in some of our very comfortable assumptions. Now, it will be a very competitive world going forward, and not just because of China. Definitely China will play a very important role in this competition. But we have agency, and I think we can decide whether we're going to have a cooperative competitive system, benign competition, race to the top, but in the good sense, or whether we're going to fall into the binary trap, the great power competition trap. And cutthroat and very malign competition, which is not going to be good for humanity by any means. So we have a choice, and I think the European Union has a very pivotal role to play in determining which track, which path we embark on. Now, this is a very complicated world, as I said, and for the last 4 years under Donald Trump, the world has not been sitting still, has not been standing still. The world has moved on, and we've seen, as has been said earlier, that geopolitical competition has increased, and we will have to deal with more confident, more assertive, sometimes more aggressive China, Turkey, Russia, and others. Are we ready for that? Which brings me to my second point, which is really about Europe's role in this very complicated world. Now, as I said earlier, I'm a great believer in the European Union, and I'm a great believer in strategic autonomy for the European Union. But when we look at the European Union that we see today, I think three things will be very important. First of all, the world is watching to see if we can be really independent actors on this global and very crowded stage. Will we stand out because we're different, or will we be imitators of those who want to play great power game? Second, what about our commitment to internal cohesion? This point was raised earlier by Timothy. Are we able to bring internal cohesion, or are our differences going to be accentuated as we move on? And finally, what about our commitment to global multilateralism? Now, multilateralism is changing. The rules-based order, as I said earlier, is changing. The world is countries are no longer ready to have be just rule takers. They also want to be rule makers. And there, I think this is going to be a very complicated juggling act for anyone who tries to be a leader, a global leader. When I look at European foreign policy, I see three faces of Europe, a bit like the three faces of Eve in that very famous movie by Hitchcock. So you see, as it has been said earlier by the other speakers, you see a very weak, and I would say almost impotent Europe when it comes to dealing with the bullies, the big boys, the hard actors in our neighborhood. And that is a real pity, because we have, I would say, a primary responsibility to be strong players in our neighborhood. But then we are not strong, and that really is a paradox. We do not have the tools, the techniques, the strategies, apart from sanctions, to deal with those in our neighborhood. This ring, if you like, of fire. That's the first element of a weak and powerless Europe dealing with its neighborhood. But this is stark contrast to a very admired and almost inspirational Pacific, call it what you will. Europe's Brussels effect, if you like, the regulatory power, the markets, the trade investment, its ability to move ahead on issues like the Green Deal, digital ethics, etc., multilateral rules-based order, that really does provoke admiration and inspiration in the wider Asia Pacific. And I would add to that, later I'll come to it in a minute, but I would add to that even in China. And then you have Europe so far in grief and almost a junior partner when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. Now, I know I've heard from everyone here before how important it is to have a strong transatlantic alliance, and I think this is going to be very, very important. But let me shatter any illusions that we have. Donald Trump, for all the difficult things and the challenges he's posed for Europe, has given us a new awareness, a new consciousness that we have to stand on our own 2 feet. And there is where the open strategic autonomy discussions have become off in limited fashion, focusing on security and defense, if you like, but they've broadened out now to talk about trade, investments, ethics, digital deal, etc. Will Europe, whether we have Trump back in the White House, which frankly I hope not, or Biden, we will have to make sure that we continue on the path of autonomy and independence and self-confidence, and that if there is a great transatlantic reignition of our, if you like, reconciliation, that it is on our terms as well, that we do not fall back into the lazy and comfortable position of being the junior partner. Ever we're faced with a challenge in our neighborhood of turning to the Americans and asking for their help and their shelter and their really Europe at a crossroads. Whatever happens in Washington tomorrow and the day after, I think we need to be very, very focused on developing our own selves. And there, as Simone, I would add a few words that have not been mentioned before. We talked about the rule of law, but I would like to come in with the word values. I would like to human rights, and not just how it comes to when dealing with populists in Hungary and others. I would say about our own government. How do we deal with our minorities? How do we deal with migrants? How do we deal with the Black Lives Matter movements? Those are the issues of diversity and inclusion, which are very important if Europe is to live up to its values and its real potency in this big and rather difficult world. Finally, on China. I used to work for a magazine published in Hong Kong called the Far Eastern Economic Review. I was their European correspondent. And so I know China very well. I've traveled there. I've worked on EU-China relations for a very long time. It's become very fashionable to talk about Europe being naive when it comes to dealing with China. I disagree with that term, naive. I think we've been very realistic in dealing with China. I think we had absolutely no illusions that China would become a democracy, but we did want China to be part of the global economic system, which it has. And moving forward, I think we're absolutely right to reject a binary choice between the US and China. And I think as we go forward, we will realize that if we're going to have a post-pandemic recovery, if we're going to have a sustained green recovery, China back and the rest of Asia is bouncing back with economic recovery and markets is going to be crucial to the economic recovery. My concern really is that China made it at some point from the rest of the world. A dual circulation shows that China is very convinced that it has to also stand on its own 2 feet, and perhaps that could lead to a very dangerous decoupling from the Western rules-based order. So with that, I will say I think it's important that we do go outside our comfort zone. And though it's very important that we work with democracies, I'm a great believer in democracies, passionate about it. I think real diplomacy also means engaging with those who don't think like it, don't think like us. And I think it's important that we live up to our own values, and that includes building a really inclusive society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shada Islams, for recalling this link between international policy and domestic issues. Very briefly, we would like to hear back from each of you, but we are reaching the end of this roundtable. So I would like to start from Timothy Garton Ash in 1 minute. Can you tell us something based on what you heard from the other speakers? Consider that tomorrow we will all be focused on the United States of America. Optimistic scenarios were depicted here. Let's not forget, however, that the scenario could be that of a re-election of Donald Trump. And what would happen in this case? Mr. Garton Ash, very quickly.
I think we'd all have to go off and have a great many drinks, because the prospect is truly terrible for all those things we value. And then the tension inherent in the notion of strategic autonomy would be becoming apparent. If strategic autonomy means standing on our own 2 feet, absolutely, that's what we need to do as Europeans. If it means we can manage absolutely fine in combating climate change and addressing the challenge of China without the United States, that's nonsense. That's for the birds. That's a complete illusion. Can I very quickly make just a couple of other points, conscious that we have limited time? First of all, we obviously need better broadband across the whole of Europe so we can all hear each other. It's very striking that we all said China is a great strategic threat, not so much Russia. I would say it's very striking that we talked so little about NATO. The true transatlantic relationship is now going to be between the US and the EU. Please note, I didn't say community of democracies. I said network of democracies. And that's a really important difference, because we'll have a big problem if we try to erect a whole new institutional alliance of a whole set of democracies. Who's in, who's out? And to what extent is India really a democracy? But a networked approach allows you to work with different sets of democracies, issue to issue. Final point. What we need above all in Europe is strategic capacity, and that means a shared strategic culture. We have all those great assets that Bernard talked about so eloquently, the internal market, the common currency, the extraordinary regulatory power of the EU, which the Brits are just finding out just how strong it is. The problem is we don't think about those assets, those power assets, strategically or geopolitically. So that's what we need to do. And if we do that, then I would share Bernard in his almost American optimism, although I would add in Gramsci's famous formula, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Thank you. Marta, Dassù. Do you share this possible conclusion? Indeed, I very much agree. In fact, it was what I was trying to say. Europe has important economic drivers, but it is not using them strategically. On strategic autonomy, I believe we're not in a true position to exert this. We are lagging too far behind, in particular on defense. And perhaps Bernard is right. Maybe 20 years from now, something much more powerful arises, but not for the time being. The only thing we've done, that is to say, the European Defence Fund has already been halved in the face of the COVID crisis, so it will be very difficult to build something convincing. In my opinion, NATO remains essential in the relationship between the United States and Europe, and in particular, Europe will not be in a position of being a neutral player. In my opinion, it should not even try to be. Europe should try and think in terms of a different relationship with the US, undoubtedly, as a more mature continent. But at least for the time being, Europe depends on the guarantee of safety and security that comes from the US, and it still has a lot of catching up to do before it can become truly independent. It is not now, and I believe that the transatlantic relationship remains essential. Thank you. Bernard Guetta, one last remark. Do you think this could be a test of maturity for the European Europe, this getting further away from the United States that was mentioned?
Certainly yes, and I will tell you one more thing, but not that different. I will tell you how happy I am to see that we share the four of us in this panel, that we share a common Weltanschauung and specifically a common view on Russia and China. The biggest problem is now China, and certainly not Russia. Russia is definitely a problem, but not the biggest one anymore, not at all. And two more points. When I arrive as a new member of the European Parliament, when I arrived in Brussels 18 months ago or something like that, I was very surprised to see that the European defense wasn't anymore a taboo, that the very idea of common investments was not anymore a taboo, and that the very idea, so French by the way, of industrial policies were not anymore a taboo. And when the crisis in Belarus started, I was also very surprised, positively surprised, to see how my friends in Poland, and not only my political friends, but my Polish friends, generally speaking, were quiet and realistic about Russia in this crisis. Almost everybody, almost everybody in the European Parliament among the Polish MEPs agreed that to solve the crisis, we would have to try to find a compromise with Mr. Putin. And after a few weeks, I was even more astonished to see that my friends, the MEPs from the Baltic countries, agreed also on this reality. We should try to search a compromise with Mr. Putin. And what would be the compromise with Mr. Putin? A new Gomulka. A man that Moscow could accept, and that would be acceptable for the people in Minsk. And so I see week after week the main ideas about the main issues in Europe becoming more and more common, even between the French and the Poles, between the Estonian and the Spaniard, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so when I hear people telling that it will be absolutely impossible to define a common foreign policy, I do think it's absolutely ridiculous, because I do think this common foreign policy becoming a reality out of the realities. Thank you.
One last remark, very shortly, Shada Islam, because we have Minister Amendola who's waiting to join us. So on the effectiveness of foreign policy, as a closing remark, something on the effectiveness of foreign policy.
Yes, thank you very much. I think to be effective on foreign policy, what we really need to do is change a new narrative, which is a new narrative, I believe, very much in the past stories of language, and not the language of power, if you like. That's the mantra that Joseph Borrell keeps repeating. The language of power. What kind of power is the question I want to ask. But we need a new narrative of self-confidence and inclusion, which allows us to face up to the challenge, not the problem of China, but the challenge posed by China, the challenge to our democracies, our values, but also the challenge to our own narrative about Eurocentric superiority faced with the rest of the world. So to be effective foreign policy players, we need to be self-confident and sure of our own selves, and not only reliant on transatlantic relations. And a united, I may add, is slowly but surely going to be changing towards a stronger and more sustained Asia pivot. Thank you very much.
Let me thank Timothy Garton Ash, Marta, Dassù, Bernard Guetta, and Shada Islam for the many ideas and food for thought they've given us, something that we'll digest over the next few weeks and following tomorrow's elections. And now, Francesca Basso, the floor is yours. We should be connected with the Italian Minister for European Affairs. I can hear him, but I cannot see him. Well, first of all, good afternoon or good evening, and thank you for joining us and taking up our invitation. Can you see me now? I can. Let me just turn to the left so that I can see you better. Thank you. I'd like to thank Fondazione Corriere and ResetDOC because I have heard this very top-level conversation. So thank you very much for giving me this chance and for your kind invitation. I'll start from a bit of an uncomfortable question, and I refer to what Garton Ash said in his keynote speech. Since, we are here to talk about democracy, but we should also talk about the policies and instruments to tackle the emergency, because that's what we are in. We're not yet after the shock. To draw a link between the two, I'd like to refer to what Garton Ash said in his keynote speech. He emphasized the issue we have within the EU to have democracy respected, and he referred to Hungary as a liberal democracy. I refer to this because that's what we have been discussing to come to agreement on the recovery fund related, or MFF. Democracy within and without Europe, and have democracies respected, is not decoupled from economy, because that poses also questions as to who your business partners will be. But talking about the recovery fund and the current situation, could you please explain to our viewers what is the situation like and what's the standstill? Because we don't talk a lot about the rule of law in Italy. And many readers and viewers would not yet understand why the recovery fund has not yet been launched. I'll try to be short and not too bureaucratic. On the 21st of July, we signed an agreement whereby 27 member countries, together with the European Commission, the ECB, managed to align all institutions on a very expansionary line of fiscal policy, a budget of 1,700 billion, and the Next Generation EU Fund. That agreement also included a chapter about the compliance with the rule of law, where a condition was introduced too, namely that states infringing Article 2 of treaties would receive less money because they would be considered as non-compliant by the European Council. As it's often the case, this agreement was taken to the parliament, and then there are two negotiations. I mean, the first one for the balance and the ceilings of the 21-27 MFF, and the other for the conditionality of the rule of law, because this condition does not yet have legal terms that can be interpreted in detail. This negotiation will go on until the end of November between European Parliament and the Council. The German presidency is actually submitted some proposals which will be supported by Italy. I think the need will be ascertained to set a condition for the rule of law, and agreement will hopefully be reached with the Parliament about quotas. As for its effect, I mean, it won't have an effect on the resources because they've already been identified and distributed to the various countries. The fact that we've got the negotiations going on until the November is negative in that parliamentary ratifications that no member states need to make for the Commission to be able to implement it might take longer, so it might take some time before the first assets are actually then granted, namely later next year. So it does not affect the Next Generation EU, but rather what's going to happen in 2021. I'm afraid I was a bit technical, but this is a very technical issue. This clearly points out how difficult decision-making processes are in Brussels. When I introduced you, I did not explain exactly what your job is, because you are a liaison between Brussels and Rome. Just oversimplifying. So you explain Brussels, Italy's point of view, and at the same time you try and convey Brussels' point of view to Rome rulers. The explanation as to how the Recovery Fund agreements works will lead me to mention another issue. In this decision-making phase, there was a time when Poland and Hungary threatened to give their veto. They said, if you do not oblige us, then we won't give the green light to the proposal. And this is just an example. But something that often happens too is that vetoes are given to hamper decisions, as is often the case in foreign policy. The most recent example was Cyprus' veto on levying sanctions against Lukashenko's team because of the election results. I mean, Cyprus wanted to have some recognition about what Turkey was doing in their territorial waters. So that's why Cyprus decided to block this political decision after the elections. 2 months were needed to then unblock it. Mrs. von der Leyen expressed her wish to come to a qualifying majority vote, especially for foreign policy. Do you agree with that? And second question, wouldn't it be a risk to adopt a QMV? Because there might be some other issues, such as migration, where some member countries would be in favor of a QMV for decision-making in terms of Dublin reform. And there, I don't think that Italy would totally agree. What's your opinion? Veto policy in Europe was never fruitful. I mean, if I take a look at 2008-12 economic crisis, a UK veto caused some convoluted fiscal policy mechanisms which were not helpful at all. I mean, they went on and on with this idea of austerity did not work. In July, it took us 4 days to negotiate, because we do negotiate in Europe. I mean, people who think that we go to Brussels or to other institutions just to bully other people around would be wrong, because we negotiate. We've got 27 different national families, so we negotiate in order to cut an agreement. Vetoes are pointless. They won't help the rule of law. They won't help tax dumping, which is something else we need to overcome. And also in the geopolitical stance of Europe, it's important to adopt a qualified majority vote, as we heard from the panelists. When we talk about the EU strategic autonomy, that applies to far-reaching choices such as green economy and digital revolution, but the same should be discussed also for what we need to do within and without European borders, and their vetoes do not get us anywhere. I think the current European Commission has the guts to do it. I mean, recently we made some choices without then amending treatments with the sugar and the next generation. We decided to issue bonds, which just 6 months ago people thought would be unreachable for us, and we do so whilst complying with the current treaties in force. So we should try and get rid of these veto policies, since we're talking about strategic autonomy.
On this issue of strategic autonomy, recently a strategy was presented in Brussels to make the European Union more autonomous. The pandemic has brought to light how Europe and European member states depend on other countries and for specific areas. For example, they depend on China and other countries for specific products. It is also true that there are 27 member states with different economic situations and with different needs. So how autonomous can the European Union be from the United States and China in economic terms, given how closely interrelated they are? And above all, how do you see, or where do you see Italy? And this is not a trivial question, because we represent a central element of the single market. And this was also the reason why some northern European countries eventually realized that they had to help struggling member states during the first wave of COVID-19, because that meant actually saving the entire European system. Yes, solidarity, but there is a common interest. We are the largest single market globally. And this is underpinned by principles of liberal democracy and defense of the rule of law. And this is something that we should never lose sight of. I do not believe in a Europe that is equally distant from other countries. We have a transatlantic relationship with the United States. The preamble of the Washington Charter in 1949 for the NATO alliance mentions values which remain at the core of Europe. As Benedetto Croce used to say, the history of Europe is a history of freedom. History, of course, evolves and changes over time, but we do confirm our principles. Clearly, COVID teaches us that the current multilateral order will necessarily have to change in many areas, for example, global legal standards, and how can you go about having not only free but also fair trade, and how on an international level you can have mutually satisfactory relationships. So these are things that the European Union has to be focused on. Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa wrote a book where he said Europe is a gentle power. Well, we are an empire which is very popular, because Europe never aspired to dominating. Europe has ever only wanted to suggest or to make suggestions or impose sanctions or incentives in many cases. But in a post-COVID world, the multilateral order needs reforming. Alliances are clear, whoever wins the elections in Washington. And above all, they are necessary within the framework of the notion of strategic autonomy. It is important to invest for our own future, but it is also important to restore and rebuild a mutually satisfactory relationship that is based on respect between the several continents. In a post-COVID world, the United Nations system too, as was the case with the World Health Organizations, well, that too will have to be questioned and dealt with. And the mechanisms that unite different peoples, continents, and political orders, knowing as we do that we defend our own system based on a liberal order, on a democratic political system, and above all, on an idea of cooperation, which is not only the result of free trade or trade interests. Last week, on Thursday afternoon, during a meeting with the press, at the end of an online meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister, both Charles Michel and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen re-emphasized the notion that the United States is an important ally of Europe and that there is the need to strengthen this alliance in order to rebuild multilateralism on a global level. Obviously, they said nothing about their hopes in terms of the upshot of the American election. And European Parliament David Sassoli was also very diplomatic in an interview with the Corriere. A survey, a poll in a few weeks ago amongst European citizens has shown that practically everywhere in all European member states, even the most eastern ones, there is the hope that Biden wins. Can you take a position, or would you rather not? And if you do, how do you see the fact that European citizens believe that Biden can dramatically change the course of the transatlantic relationship? As it emerged tonight, a few things will change, not everything will change. And then, of course, on trade, there are problems that need addressing and that go beyond the very notion of America first. Well, you see, there are trends that go beyond who's actually president. Let's have a look at the Middle East, for example. Obama and Trump had a similar policy. This renewed interest in the Middle East. So there are elements which are indeed ideological in nature. And there are complexities involved in terms of the what the situation will be like according to who wins. But let's try not to be self-centered in Europe when reading the results. There are trends that do exist, and we should look at them. I do not believe that Europe should be equally distant from different partners. The transatlantic relationship remains strong, and it is not dependent on who's in charge in Washington. It is based on principles, values, and mutual interest. In parallel, we should be truly focused on attaining our own strategic autonomy. NATO is and will remain our military alliance, which does not mean, however, that Europe should not focus on becoming strategically autonomous in terms of defense, production, civil areas, and the new digital highways and the new technology. So this does not mean that in all these areas Europe should not be autonomous. These are two things that go in parallel. Never before in this highly competitive world, Europe's strategic autonomy is paramount. Let's get back to the emergency. We only have about 10 minutes left. And I'd like to mention Timothy Garton Ash once again, because he was really poignant when he said we need better broadband in Europe, because we did have a few glitches.
We just did not have connection links in Italy, but also abroad. So it wasn't just us. I don't know whether that's consolation. I mean, in the UK, his broadband was great, whilst the rest of us in the EU were a bit flawed. Having said this, what about the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience? I know that it's expected by end of December, or actually the official deadline is April, but in order to have access to funds earlier, it would be better than to bring it forward. I know that you went to Brussels and you met with the task force, so there is an ongoing dialogue. As I said, you act as a liaison, and you brief then European Council minutes, but also the Recovery Fund is controlled and monitored by you as opposed to by the ECOFIN, you know, the 19 countries that are part of the Eurozone as opposed to the 27 as a total. So one might expect that the Recovery Fund would be discussed by the European finance ministers, but that's not the case. So how is it going? I mean, it's a team effort, Rome, Brussels, the whole of Italy. We decided to have a number of steps. I mean, our guidelines were submitted to the Parliament. The Parliament discussed it for a month and eventually approved it by providing the right specifications for the approval of the national plan. And I'm glad that there was not just a majority approval, but also positive abstention of then the opposition. I think there needs to be cohesion, government, parliament, local, institutional, and social players, such as businesses, trade unions, and also the service sector. So there needs to be an ongoing in a dialogue. At the same time, we entertain some discussions with the Commission in Brussels. Our task force people are constantly in touch with them because we hope that by the end of December, we want to implement this plan. So each step will be disclosed to the Parliament. Because when we talk about guidelines and the related actions, and the same is true also for the list of projects, and here is just a few dozens as opposed to hundreds, because we need to focus our investment on clearly defined projects, you know, such as Green Deal, digital transformation, education, social equality, and education and training, which we agreed on as the EU, and that's something where we need to get mobilized. There was also an issue of governance. As the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Conte, said, it would be necessary ordinary governance in order to manage these resources by the mainland. So commitment by 2023 and it will be spent by 2026. And my ministry is then the leader, but then we cooperate with a lot of other Italian ministries, as well as we coordinate ourselves with regional authorities and municipalities, because not only will we have to plan it properly, but then we also have to implement and actually use these resources for the good of Italy. The Recovery Fund, also called Next Generation EU, as the Commission named it, consists of money to leave a better Europe to the next generation. That's the meaning of the name. Is the response to the first wave. We are now in the midst of a second wave, which is not sparing any country. I mean, even those countries which in the first wave had somehow managed to be less affected by the pandemic, this time over the situation is much more generalized. The president of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, repeatedly invited member states about the opportunity of turning the Recovery Fund into something permanent. Over the last few days in Brussels, both Dombrovskis and van der Leyen were asked during press conferences whether they were thinking of a new instrument, and they always reply, well, let's get the existing ones working. I mean, we've got 540 billion euros that were earmarked in spring, and I'm referring to SURE, to the ESM for then health, as well as the European Investment Bank funds. But if then the ECB chairwoman says there is a problem, and there must be one, so should the European Recovery Fund turned into a permanent asset? Has the time come to discuss it, even though the final agreement on the previous package is not yet there? Let me start from a strength. Last July, we managed to then join forces and present a united front. So the Commission and the ECB with a very strong plan, and then the generation for the European Council. So this united front needs to continue to be effective, because we are facing the unknown. We'll have to wait until the 5th of November when the Commission Economic Outlook will be issued. And as you said, both the Stability Act and state aids, as the Commission said, will have to decide depending on the course. Our priority is to fight COVID and to protect citizens from the social and economic crisis. Well, I think that this united front with innovative instruments such as Next Generation and SURE are just the first step of a new path, a new journey. If someone thinks that we are to go back to business as usual, both in Italy and Brussels, is totally wrong. First of all, we have adopted new techniques and choices within the framework of strategic autonomy, as the panelists said, and also then the need for the 27 member countries, the Commission, is to keep on going, to keep on changing the rules, because the rules as we know them so far, as you have seen, have crumbled with the advent of the crisis. So fiscal dumping can no longer exist, or social dumping even less, because these things will then disrupt in solidity and stability. I don't know whether the Next Generation EU is just the first step of a new edition, but it's certainly the first step of a European history which will not trace back its steps, not as it was before COVID. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I'd also to thank the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. for supporting this initiative. Enjoy the rest of the evening. I hope that the last 90 minutes with ResetDOC and Fondazione Corriere della Sera were useful to you and help you to have a clearer idea about such essential topics for the future of the EU. Thank you, Simone. I'd like to thank you as well as Fondazione Corriere for making this all possible. I'd like to thank all the staff, including technicians who work very hard backstage, as well as the ResetDOC team. Then stay tuned on the initiatives for these two organizations. We already have something on slate for the next few weeks. Thank you.